I love Jesus, and I don't mean to be disrespectful or sacrilegious, but can we agree that he sometimes said and taught some crazy things? I don't mean insane kind of crazy. I mean crazy in the sense of being so out there, so different, so foreign to our typical ways of thinking and living that we have trouble sometimes even understanding them, much less really buying into them and living by them. Take, for example, the one we heard today. If you want to be my follower, you need to forget about yourself. You'll need to take up your cross every day and follow me. If you try to save your life, you'll destroy it. But if you give up your life for me, you'll save it. In some versions, we have the words you'll find it. Even deeply devoted disciples, when they hear these words, have a kind of backpedaling reaction. Jesus, I do believe in you, and I trust that there's some truth in those words you said, but forget about myself? Take up my cross? Hey, if I don't look out for myself, people are going to take advantage of me. And I don't see how trying to save one's life is a bad thing. How am I going to do anything or help anyone if I give up my life? For the time being this morning, can we just acknowledge that if there is something right and worth listening to in these words, it seems like it must be in some kind of secret code, in a metaphor of some sort. Maybe he's using phrases that made sense back then, but which we don't understand today. Sometimes that happens when we read the Bible. These words of Jesus are about the Christian discipline of submission. That's what this morning's sermon is about, and already some of us don't like it. I understand. Submissive is not a word that describes how we want to be, and submitting doesn't feel like something we want to do. I know women who might not be alive today if they hadn't stopped being submissive, putting up with the domestic violence they suffered. I have friends and extended family who got tired of the verbal and psychological abuse they took from parents or sick religious systems. It was finding the strength to not put up with that treatment any longer that saved them. When we talk about submission as a spiritual discipline, we're talking about a very different set of ideas. Submission as a spiritual discipline does not mean weakness. Being submissive does not mean letting other people take advantage of us or misuse us. There are Bible verses that have been used at various points in history to justify oppressing people and to promote patriarchal and very sexist understandings of marriage. The Bible was written at a time when women were little more than property, when it was not unusual for young girls to be given in marriage by their families to whomever the family decided had enough money to exchange for her. The Apostle Paul's verse about wives being submissive to their husbands has been taken out of context and at times used to keep women down and even excuse abuse. Cult leaders demand submission to their ideas and whatever else they want their followers to do as a way of controlling them and getting from them. None of these things are what I'm referring to this morning. The spiritual discipline of submission is about learning to put our desires and appetites in their right place when it comes to doing the will of God and when it comes to living as a follower of Jesus. It's about giving up the need to be the boss of our own lives and others' lives, or to demand that others do things our way in all circumstances, which in so many cases is actually a sign of insecurity, not being able to trust others. It's about being smart enough to let ourselves be guided by God and to be guided by other people that God uses to guide us, and to be guided by the collected wisdom found in the Scriptures. There's a lot to say on this subject, so we'll need to move quickly. Let's begin. First of all, our faith tells us that the most important thing we can do is to do the will of God. A lot of people think that means doing something religious, becoming a missionary, devoting untold hours to working in a soup kitchen. It includes those things, but we need to reframe our understanding of what it means to do the will of God. Doing the will of God can mean things as ordinary as going to work or being a good neighbor or going to a party. But in all cases, the emphasis is upon the doing, not just knowing or hearing or becoming aware of what is right and good, but doing it. Sometimes when I am in a worship service, usually in our traditional service, but sometimes when I'm down here, or even when I hear our modern worship band practicing, I say a little prayer of thanks, thanking God for the beauty and inspiration of their music, for giving them the talent they have, even though I know they've also worked hard at developing that talent. But then I realize it's not just the talent that is the blessing, it's their willingness to share it. A person may have ability and keep it to themselves. They have the potential to do good, but may not do it. So a person may know what God's will is, but unless they submit to God in using what God has given them or directed them to do, how does that do any good? When it comes to being faithful in our giving, our sharing, our tithing, our helping, it's not just the having the ability or being able to. People can be rich and be miserable. They can be wealthy and miserly. They can be healthy and shiftless. It's the willingness to let God guide us in the use of those things that matters and which accomplishes the greater good. It also builds us up spiritually through the act and discipline of submission. Submission is simply the willingness to cooperate with God, whether it's speaking up or being silent, whether it's helping lead or letting others lead. It could involve being out front or working behind the scenes. One of the biggest freedoms submission gives us is in teaching us how to get our ego out of the way and to experience how following God and God's ways results in a better and more satisfying and purposeful life than one that we ourselves are the directors of. Over the past few months, I've been working on an idea about how so many of our world's problems and the problems in our minds and friendships and marriages and families and workplaces and in our souls can be compared to cancer. I'm not a medical expert, but here's a little of what I know about cancer. There are many types of cancer, but generally speaking, cancer happens when cells develop abnormally and they begin to divide uncontrollably. Their genetic instructions get messed up. So what were normal, healthy cells created to play a role in the overall function of the body sort of go renegade, take over, no longer play the role they were meant to play. They no longer submit to the greater good. They do their own thing. And in so doing, they bring disease and dysfunction, and all too often, death. People can be like that. Churches and church members can be like that. Politicians and parents can be like that. Bosses and corporations and spouses and children can be like that. Focusing on getting, taking over, being in control, arguing about things that in a few weeks or years' time won't amount to anything. But they're just so invested or need to control so badly that friendships end, churches split, relatives stop getting together. It's like a cancer that I guess you could say won by taking over other organs and getting its way in terms of spreading its influence, but at the expense of the body itself. There's just one suggestion I want to share for our homework together this week on learning and growing in the discipline of submission. Here it is. Practice small repeatedly so that big is possible eventually. Let me say it again. Practice small repeatedly so that big is possible eventually. Jesus said, "The one who is faithful in small things will be faithful in large things. Whoever is dishonest in small matters will be dishonest in larger ones." The way to learn submission to God in our lives is to practice submission in little things. Learn to do little things that may or may not be what you want to do or is most convenient, but won't kill you and will accomplish some good. Learn what it feels like to sense a nudge from God that may take you out of the way of your carefully crafted schedule for the day, or the plans that you had for the next few minutes, and submit to what you may sense God asking you to do. This helps us discover that there are sometimes more important things than our plans and schedules, and maybe even some better ideas than the one we ourselves came up with. And I will bet that you're going to find yourself doing and experiencing some pretty wonderful things. This is what we call living by the Spirit. Years ago, when I was serving up in Oklahoma, I got a telephone call from one of the local funeral homes asking me to officiate at the funeral of a man whom I did not know. He was not a member of our church, but you never know how these things might turn out in terms of maybe making a connection with the family and helping them through such a time. So I got the name and telephone number of his widow. The man had died early that morning, and so just a few hours later, I called to arrange a time to go and visit with her. She said she was really busy and didn't have much time, but if I could come right away, she'd be there. Well, when I got there, I introduced myself to this woman whom I would guess to be in her mid-60s. I told her I was sorry for her loss. She seemed to be taking it pretty well. She introduced me to the deceased man's brother, who was there, and to his children, the man's adult niece and nephew. I asked, "When do you think you might feel up to discussing funeral arrangements?" And she said, "Well, now it's fine." By this time, the other three relatives had gone to the couch in an adjacent room and were watching a football game. The Minnesota Vikings were playing, I recall that. So I asked her about this man, what information I should know to properly conduct his funeral service. The wife told me where he worked, when he was born, basic statistical information. "But what about him as a person?" I said. "What can you tell me about what he was like?" From the other room, his nephew jumped into the conversation. He raised his voice, having overheard my question, and said, "He always had to win." I looked to the wife to see her reaction to this comment. She just lowered her gaze. There was a moment of silence, and so I sort of called to this nephew. "What do you mean?" I asked. This time it was the man's brother who spoke up, and he said he always had to be right. Every conversation, every discussion, he never admitted he might be wrong. And then he motioned to the man's widow and said her opinion never mattered. He was so insecure he had to make everyone else feel bad to make himself feel good. Having said that, from the couch, They went back to watching the ball game on TV. Several times I sort of called to them, asking them questions about this man. They answered without ever looking away from the ball game. I later learned that there were two daughters, neither of whom were coming to the funeral. The man had money. He seemed to live in a fairly comfortable home, but he'd never shared any of his money. He never joined a church. He never joined any clubs or organizations. At the funeral 2 days later, the time came for the service to begin, and there was not a soul there. These 4 family members that I'd met, plus 2 other family members, were ushered in the way they are at the beginning of the funeral. They sat on the front row. I waited. I waited until 5 minutes past the scheduled starting time, and then the funeral director motioned for me to go ahead and begin. I did, but no one came. It was quite an experience. I remember thinking, here's this guy who thought he had power. He had to be right. He had to be in charge. I think he missed the boat. The last thing I want to say this morning is that submission is the path to joy and fulfillment, even if your path is different from mine. Now, this is going to sound heretical to some people who focus only on the afterlife, but I believe this. God rewards us in the here and now. When you're nice to someone, when you do what you think is God's will in helping someone else, it may not help that other person. It may not even be noticed, but it makes a difference in your life. Why? Because you did what you felt was right. You were led by something higher than just your own convenience. Now turn it around. If I mistreat someone else, try to embarrass them, put them down, they may not be hurt or feel embarrassed, but it will hurt me. If I give in to the urge to gossip about somebody, they might not ever learn that I did so, but it hurts me. I've become like I chose to be, and I'm stuck with it. God saves us by inviting us to be transformed, to submit ourselves to a better way of being. And there's joy in that. There's reward in that. It's almost like we lose our lives, but gain a better one. It sounds crazy, I know. But here's some good news. It's true. Thanks be to God. Amen.